The fluorescent lights of Denver International Airport hummed overhead as hundreds of travelers rushed through the terminal corridors. Among the sea of civilians, two men stood out, though for vastly different reasons. One drew attention deliberately. The other commanded it, without trying. Lieutenant Commander Jake Razor Morrison moved through the crowd with the confident swagger that came with being a decorated Navy SEAL. His muscular frame filled out his desert camouflage uniform perfectly, and the distinctive trident pin on his chest caught the light as he walked. Fresh from a deployment in the Middle East, Jake carried himself with the air of someone who had seen combat and lived to tell about it. His shaved head, sunglasses, and the slight limp from his latest mission gave him an intimidating presence that made other travelers step aside. Jake was used to being recognized, used to the respectful nods from other service members, and definitely used to being treated as the elite warrior he had trained his entire adult life to become. At 32 years old, he had completed 7 deployments, earned 2 Purple Hearts, and led countless high-stakes operations behind enemy lines. In his world, rank meant everything, and his rank as a lieutenant commander in the most elite fighting force in the world meant he was somebody important. The second man moved through the airport with a completely different energy. General William Bill Patterson walked quietly, almost invisibly, despite his imposing 6'3" frame. Unlike Jake, the general wore simple civilian clothes, khakis, a polo shirt, and a worn baseball cap that had seen better days. His graying hair was neatly trimmed, but not in the high and tight style that screamed military. At 58 years old, his weathered face told stories of decades in service, but he preferred to let his actions speak, rather than his appearance. What Jake couldn't see, and what very few people in that airport would have recognized, was that General Patterson was one of the most decorated 4-star generals in the United States Army. His chest, if it had been covered in ribbons, would have displayed a career spanning 3 decades, including multiple combat deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and several classified operations that would never make the history books. He had commanded divisions, led joint operations with international forces, and advised presidents on matters of national security. But today, he was just a tired man heading home to see his family after weeks of meetings at the Pentagon. The two men's paths would never have crossed if not for the delayed flight to San Diego. A mechanical issue with their aircraft had stranded passengers in the terminal for over 3 hours, and the waiting area near Gate B-27 had become a temporary community of frustrated travelers. Jake had claimed a seat near the gate counter, his gear bag taking up the space beside him, while he scrolled through social media posts from his SEAL teammates, still deployed overseas. General Patterson sat quietly in a corner seat, reading a paperback novel and occasionally checking his phone for updates from his aide-de-camp about his schedule for the following week. He had learned long ago that travel delays were just part of military life, and getting upset about things beyond his control was a waste of energy. Instead, he used the time to catch up on reading and reflect on the meetings he had just completed regarding the next phase of Special Operations training protocols. The airport's intercom crackled to life every 30 minutes with updates about the delayed flight. Each announcement met with collective groans from the waiting passengers. Families with young children struggled to keep their kids entertained. Business travelers typed furiously on laptops, and service members in various uniforms sat scattered throughout the gate area. Jake noticed the older man in civilian clothes sitting alone and initially paid him no attention. In Jake's experience, civilians rarely understood what it meant to serve, and he had little patience for small talk with people who had never put their lives on the line for their country. He was more interested in the Army Ranger in dress blue sitting 2 rows away, and the Marine in dress uniform who had nodded respectfully when Jake passed by earlier. As the delay stretched into its 4th hour, the gate area became more crowded as another delayed flight was moved to an adjacent gate. Passengers began sharing power outlets, striking up conversations, and generally making the best of an annoying situation. The airline staff had provided vouchers for food and drinks, and several small groups had formed as people discovered they were traveling for similar reasons. It was during this mixing of passengers that Jake first really looked at General Patterson. The older man had given up his seat to a pregnant woman, and was now standing near the windows, still reading his book with remarkable focus, despite the chaos around him. Something about the man's bearing caught Jake's attention, the way he stood, the way he held himself, the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from him even in civilian clothes. Jake's military training had taught him to assess potential threats and allies quickly, and his gut told him this man had some kind of military background. But without a uniform or obvious indicators, Jake couldn't be sure. The man's age suggested he might be a retiree, perhaps someone who had served decades ago during peacetime. Jake had met plenty of former service members who liked to talk about their time in the military, usually inflating their roles and importance as the years passed. Curiosity got the better of Jake, and he decided to walk over and strike up a conversation. After all, if this guy was former military, he would probably be impressed to meet an active-duty SEAL. Jake was used to people being awed by his special operations background, and he enjoyed sharing stories about his deployments when appropriate. It was also a good way to pass the time during what was shaping up to be a very long delay. As Jake approached, General Patterson looked up from his book with a polite smile. Up close, Jake could see the man's eyes were sharp and alert, the kind of eyes that missed very little. There was something familiar about his bearing that Jake couldn't quite place, but he was confident that whatever this man's background was, it couldn't compare to the elite training and combat experience of a Navy SEAL. The conversation was about to begin that would change both men's perspectives on assumptions, respect, and what it truly meant to serve at the highest levels of military leadership. Jake walked over with the confident stride that had become second nature after years of elite training. He extended his hand toward the older man, who immediately set down his book and returned the handshake with a firm grip that surprised Jake with its strength. "Afternoon," Jake said, noting the man's solid handshake and direct eye contact. "I'm Jake Morrison, Navy SEALs. Mind if I ask what your background is? You've got the bearing of someone who's served." General Patterson smiled warmly and nodded. "Bill Patterson. Yes, I served for a while. Army. And you're absolutely right about the delays being part of military life. I've spent more hours in airports than I care to count over the years." Jake's eyes lit up with interest. "Army." That explained the bearing, though Jake noted the man said he served for a while, rather than giving specifics. In Jake's experience, that usually meant someone had done their basic service time and gotten out, probably decades ago based on the man's age. Still, any military service deserved some respect, even if it wasn't special operations. "Army, huh? What was your MOS?" Jake asked, using the military term for job specialty. He settled into a more relaxed stance, prepared to be polite to a fellow veteran, even if the man's service had been relatively routine. "Oh, I bounced around quite a bit," General Patterson replied diplomatically. "Started as an infantry officer, but ended up doing various assignments over the years. Command positions, staff work, that sort of thing. What about you? How long have you been with the teams?" Jake appreciated that the older man used the correct term, teams, instead of saying Navy SEALs, which showed he had at least some familiarity with special operations terminology. That was more than most people knew. 12 years now," Jake said with obvious pride. 7 deployments, mostly Iraq and Afghanistan, but some other places I can't really talk about. Just finished up as a task unit commander on my last deployment. It's a whole different world from regular military service. You know?" The comment was delivered with what Jake thought was tactful honesty. He wasn't trying to insult the older man, but there was a significant difference between regular Army service and being part of the most elite fighting force in the world. Jake had earned his trident through some of the most challenging training known to man, and his combat experience was something most military members would never come close to experiencing. General Patterson nodded thoughtfully. "I imagine it is quite different. The level of training and preparation you guys go through is remarkable. I have a lot of respect for what the special operations community does." Jake warmed to the subject, encouraged by the man's apparent interest and respect. "Yeah, it's intense. Hell Week alone weeds out about 80% of candidates, and that's just the beginning. Then you've got months more of training before you even get to a team. And once you're there, the real learning starts. Combat deployments, high-value target raids, hostage rescue, it's not something everyone can handle. I'm sure it takes a special kind of person," General Patterson agreed. "The mental toughness alone must be incredible." Jake was beginning to enjoy the conversation. It wasn't often he met someone who seemed to genuinely appreciate what SEALs went through without either being intimidated or trying to one-up him with their own stories. This Bill guy seemed like a decent man who understood his place in the military hierarchy. "So what was your rank when you got out?" Jake asked, genuinely curious now. "And what unit were you with?" General Patterson hesitated for just a moment. "I served with several different units over the years. As for rank, well, I made it fairly high up before I retired." The vague answer triggered something in Jake's mind. He had met plenty of former military who were evasive about their service, and in his experience, it usually meant one of two things. Either they were embarrassed about their rank or role, or they were inflating their importance. Given this man's age and the time frame he would have served, Jake suspected he was probably a former enlisted man or maybe a junior officer who had gotten out after his minimum commitment. "Come on, Bill," Jake said with a grin that was friendly but had an edge to it. "What's your rank?" I shared mine. Lieutenant Commander in the Navy, which is equivalent to a major in the Army. Pretty good for 12 years of service, especially in the teams where promotion can be competitive. Jake's tone had shifted slightly, becoming more challenging. He was still being respectful, but there was now an undertone of superiority creeping in. In Jake's world, rank mattered enormously, and he had worked incredibly hard to achieve his position as a lieutenant commander in the special operations community. He had earned every bit of respect that came with his rank and his trident. General Patterson's expression remained neutral, but something subtle changed in his posture. "I appreciate your service, Jake. 12 years as a SEAL is impressive, and Lieutenant Commander is definitely a solid rank for someone your age." Jake noticed that the man still hadn't answered the question directly, which only confirmed his suspicions. "You still haven't told me what your rank was, Bill. What are you trying to hide? Were you enlisted?" "Nothing wrong with that. But why be secretive about it?" The challenge in Jake's voice was now unmistakable. Several other passengers in the waiting area had begun to pay attention to their conversation, sensing the subtle tension that was building between the two men. "Listen, Bill," Jake continued, his voice getting slightly louder and more condescending. "I get it if you're uncomfortable talking rank with someone like me. Not everyone can handle the pressure of command in special operations, but there's no shame in having served as enlisted or even as a junior officer in regular Army units. We can't all be elite warriors." General Patterson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained calm and measured. "Jake, I think there might be some assumptions being made here that—" "Assumptions?" Jake interrupted, his SEAL arrogance now fully engaged. "Look, I'm not trying to embarrass you here, but let's be real about what we're talking about. I'm a lieutenant commander in the Navy SEALs. I've led men into combat, made life or death decisions under fire, and earned my rank through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Whatever you did in your Army career, and I'm sure it was honorable service, it wasn't at this level." The waiting area had grown quieter as more people became aware of the increasingly heated exchange. A Marine in dress uniform who had been reading nearby put down his newspaper and began paying closer attention. An Air Force Master Sergeant looked up from his laptop with a concerned expression. "So come on, Bill," Jake pressed, his voice now carrying the commanding tone he used with subordinates. "What's your rank? And don't give me any more vague answers about serving for a while and making it fairly high up. I've been straight with you about who I am and what I've accomplished. The least you can do is return the courtesy." General Patterson looked around the waiting area, noting the attention they were drawing, then looked back at Jake with eyes that had grown considerably colder. When he spoke, his voice was still controlled, but there was now an unmistakable edge of authority that Jake's tunnel vision prevented him from recognizing. "Jake, I really think you should consider the possibility that you don't have the full picture here." But Jake was too far into his superiority complex to back down now. In his mind, he was simply establishing the natural order of things. He was elite special operations, and this man was clearly a former regular Army soldier trying to avoid admitting his lower station. It was time to settle this question once and for all. "The full picture?" Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The picture seems pretty clear to me. You're avoiding a simple question about rank because you know it doesn't compare to mine. Look, I respect all service members, but let's not pretend we're equals here. What's your rank, Bill? Just answer the question." The tension in the air was now thick enough to cut with a knife, and General Patterson realized that this young SEAL's arrogance had reached a point where only a direct confrontation was going to resolve the situation. The time for diplomatic evasion was over. General Patterson stood up slowly from his position by the window, and for the first time, Jake noticed that several other service members in the terminal had begun moving closer to their conversation. The Marine in dress uniform was now standing at attention, as was the Air Force Master Sergeant, both watching the exchange with expressions that Jake couldn't quite read. "All right, Jake," General Patterson said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to fill the space around them. "Since you're so insistent on knowing my rank, I'll tell you. But first, let me ask you something. In your 12 years of service, how many four-star generals have you met? Jake's confident expression faltered slightly. The question was oddly specific, and something about the way it was asked made his stomach begin to tighten with an uncomfortable feeling he couldn't identify. Four-star generals? I mean, I've seen them at ceremonies and briefings, but I wouldn't say I've met any, personally. Why? Because, General Patterson said, reaching into his back pocket, you're about to meet your first one. Jake watched in growing horror as the older man pulled out a military ID card and held it up so Jake could read it clearly. The card was unmistakable in its official formatting, and the rank listed made Jake's blood run cold. General William Patterson, United States Army. 010. 4 stars. The sound of Jake's own heartbeat suddenly seemed deafeningly loud in his ears as the full magnitude of his mistake crashed down on him like a tidal wave. This wasn't some former enlisted man or junior officer trying to avoid embarrassment about his rank. This was a 4-star general, one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire United States military. There were fewer than 44-star generals and admirals in all branches of service combined, making General Patterson one of the most senior military leaders in the country. Jake's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Around the terminal, he suddenly understood why the other service members were standing at attention. They had recognized General Patterson, probably from the moment he had shown his ID at security, and had been watching in stunned silence as a lieutenant commander publicly humiliated himself in front of one of the most powerful men in the military. Sir, Jake began, but General Patterson raised a hand to stop him. Let me explain something to you, Lieutenant Commander Morrison, the general said, and Jake noticed that his tone had completely transformed. Gone was the friendly, patient man who had been trying to deflect Jake's aggressive questioning. In his place stood a 4-star general who had commanded divisions in combat and advised presidents on matters of war and peace. I've been in the Army for 36 years. I started as a second lieutenant in the infantry, just like thousands of other young officers, but over those 3.5 decades, I've commanded at every level from platoon to division. I've led troops in combat in Iraq, Afghanistan, and several other places that remain classified. I've been responsible for the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and I've made decisions that have affected national security at the highest levels. Jake stood frozen, his face growing redder by the second as the general continued. I've been the commanding general of the 82nd Airborne Division. I've commanded U.S. forces in Central Command, and for the past 2 years, I've been the commanding general of Special Operations Command. That means, Lieutenant Commander, that technically speaking, I'm your boss's boss's boss. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. SOCOM Special Operations Command was the unified command that oversaw all Special Operations forces, including Navy SEALs. This man wasn't just any 4-star general. He was the 4-star general in charge of all special operations in the U.S. military. Jake had just spent the last 20 minutes lecturing his ultimate commanding officer about how regular Army service couldn't compare to elite special operations. Furthermore, General Patterson continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to briefing presidents and cabinet members. I've worked directly with SEAL Team 6, Delta Force, the 160th SOAR, and every other special operations unit in our inventory. I've planned and overseen missions that you'll never hear about in the news, and I've sent men like you on operations that required presidential approval. The Marine and Air Force NCO who had been watching were now clearly struggling not to smile at Jake's predicament, while several civilian passengers had stopped what they were doing to watch the extraordinary dressing down taking place in front of them. Now, as for your comments about rank and service, the general said, his tone becoming somewhat sharper, let me remind you that rank in the military isn't just about time served or personal achievement. It's about responsibility, leadership, and the trust placed in you by your country. When you wear those lieutenant commander bars, you're not just representing yourself, you're representing every SEAL who has ever served, and every service member under your command. Jake wanted to disappear into the floor. Every word from General Patterson was a reminder of how badly he had misjudged the situation, and how unprofessional his behavior had been. He had violated every principle of military courtesy and respect that had been drilled into him since his first day in the Navy. Sir, I sincerely apologize, Jake managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I made assumptions that were completely wrong, and I was disrespectful to a senior officer. There's no excuse for my behavior. General Patterson studied Jake for a long moment, and when he spoke again, His voice had softened slightly, taking on the tone of a leader teaching a lesson rather than administering punishment. Jake, you're a decorated SEAL with an impressive record of service. Your training and combat experience are valuable assets to our military, and your dedication to your country is clear. But today, you've learned an important lesson that I hope you'll carry with you for the rest of your career. The general paused, making sure he had Jake's full attention. Never assume you know someone's story based on appearances alone. The man sitting quietly in civilian clothes might be a Medal of Honor recipient. The woman who looks too young to have experience might be a pilot who's flown combat missions over enemy territory. The senior NCO who seems like just enlisted might have more combat experience than officers twice his rank. Respect is earned through service and character, not through assumptions about rank or position. Jake nodded, understanding that he was receiving a masterclass in leadership from one of the most senior military leaders in the country. This was a lesson he would never forget, regardless of how embarrassing it was to learn it in such a public setting. I've spent my entire career working alongside Special Operations Forces, General Patterson continued. I have tremendous respect for what you and your teammates do, but that respect goes both ways. Every service member, regardless of rank or branch, deserves to be treated with basic dignity until they prove otherwise through their actions. The general looked around the terminal, noting that their conversation had drawn quite an audience, then looked back at Jake. I'm not going to report this incident, Lieutenant Commander, because I believe you've learned something valuable today. But I want you to think about this moment the next time you meet someone whose story you don't know. The military is made up of millions of people who have served with honor in countless different ways. Your path as a SEAL is just one of many ways to serve your country with distinction. Jake stood straighter, finding his voice again. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I will definitely carry this lesson with me, and I promise it will make me a better leader and a better person. General Patterson smiled for the first time since revealing his identity, and Jake could see the kindness that had been there before his arrogance had taken over the conversation. I believe you will, Jake. The fact that you can admit your mistake and learn from it tells me everything I need to know about your character. The Navy is lucky to have you, and the men you lead are fortunate to serve under someone who's willing to grow and improve. The announcement over the airport intercom interrupted the moment, informing passengers that their delayed flight was finally ready for boarding. As people began gathering their belongings and moving toward the gate, General Patterson extended his hand to Jake once more. It was a pleasure meeting you, Lieutenant Commander Morrison. Keep up the good work, and remember, leadership isn't about being the toughest guy in the room. Sometimes it's about being humble enough to learn something new. Jake shook the general's hand with a grip that was firm but respectful, a far cry from the cocky confidence he had displayed earlier. As they boarded the plane together, Jake realized that he had just received one of the most valuable leadership lessons of his military career, from one of the most qualified teachers in the world. The story of what happened that day would eventually make its way through military circles, serving as a reminder to service members at all levels about the importance of humility, respect, and never making assumptions about the quiet professional sitting next to you.